The book begins with some men lazing around on the deck of a yacht, waiting for the tide to go out on the Thames River. One of the men, Charlie Marlowe, imagines what it was like when the first Romans explored the area some 1900 years earlier, back when it was still untamed marshland that had yet to be civilized. The thought leads him to recount his own story about traveling to an uncivilized place. Marlowe has already been a sailor for years at this point, and he gets a desire to go to Africa, which had fascinated him when he was a boy because it was largely unexplored. Right away, he finds a job with a European trading company. He's the captain of a steamboat that's headed into the center of Africa, where they export ivory. Marlowe leaves on a French steamer and heads down the African coast to the river where he's supposed to meet his boat. The trip takes more than 30 days, and along the way, he sees a French gunboat firing blindly into the jungle, apparently engaged in a war with the natives. He says there seemed to be something insane about it. Marlowe arrives at the first company station. All around, he sees men who have been taken captive and put to work. The company calls them criminals, but they're basically slaves. Marlowe is stuck at the station for another 10 days, and he learns about Mr. Kurtz, an agent for the company in the deepest part of the jungle. He hears Kurtz is a remarkable man, and that the higher-ups in Europe have big plans for him. It takes another 15 days of hiking through the jungle before Marlowe finally reaches the central station, where he's supposed to pick up his steamboat. But when he gets there, he finds out his steamboat has sunk. The manager of the station estimates it will take Marlowe 3 months to fix it, and urges Marlowe to hurry. They need to relieve the upriver stations, and there have already been so many delays that he doesn't know who's dead and who's alive up there. The manager also mentions Kurtz, calling him the best agent they have. He sends out more ivory than all the other agents combined. In the months it takes him to fix the boat, Marlowe meets the station's brickmaker, though Marlowe never sees evidence of any bricks being made in his time there. The brickmaker mentions Kurtz, calling him a prodigy, and an emissary of pity and science and progress. One evening, Marlowe overhears a conversation between the station manager and another man. This man, who happens to be the station manager's uncle, is the leader of the El Dorado exploring expedition, a greedy mining group searching for anything valuable in the region. Marlowe only picks up snippets of their talk, but he gathers that more than a year ago, Kurtz sent a note to the manager asking to be left alone. Since then, Kurtz had sent a large quantity of high-quality ivory down the river in a fleet of canoes. Marlowe also hears them say that a competitor has intruded on Kurtz's district, and they think he should be hanged to make an example of him. Eventually, Marlowe begins the long journey upriver. The manager and some others go with him, and they enlist 20 Africans who Marlowe says are cannibals. The manager favors one of them, a young boy. During the trip, they pass tribal villages whose inhabitants shout and jump around when they see the boat. Marlowe says it thrilled him to think of the humanity he shared with these prehistoric people. He implies, in an arguably racist way, that even though he's civilized and European, he could feel a primitive part in himself, responding to their shouts, and that everyone has this vestigial, prehistoric instinct. They come to a hut made of reeds on the riverbank, and Marlowe gets off the boat to explore. There's a wood pile out front, and on top of the pile is a board with writing that says, "Wood for you, hurry up, approach cautiously." In the hut, he finds a book called An Inquiry into Some Points of Seamanship, so Marlowe surmises the resident must have been English. The manager thinks it's the intruder he heard about. In the morning, a few days later, a thick fog holds them up. They can't move because they can't see anything, and then they hear this loud scream. But nothing happens, and eventually the fog clears. They're attacked 2 hours later, when they enter a very narrow channel of the river. The attackers fire arrows at them. A spear hits the helmsman in the pilot house with Marlowe, and the helmsman collapses and dies. His blood gets all over Marlowe's shoes. Marlowe thinks that with such hostility around, Kurtz must surely be dead, and he laments that he'll never get to hear Kurtz speak. He thinks of Kurtz and his ideas, and of a report Kurtz wrote for the International Society for the Suppression of Savage Customs. In the report, Kurtz wrote that the white man, because he is so developed, must appear to the savages like a supernatural being. With that authority, the white man can exert a power for good that is practically unbounded. In other words, the white man can civilize them. But Marlowe says Kurtz wrote this before he became unstable and started taking part in tribal rituals. After that happened, Kurtz added a note at the end of the report that said, "Exterminate all the brutes." On the river, they come to a clearing, and up on a slope they can see a decaying building. A man waves to them from the shore. They finally reach the inner station, 2 months after leaving the central station. While the manager and some of the others hike up to the station, Marlowe talks to this man. The man is a Russian who works for a Dutch trading company, and for 2 years he'd been on the river. That's how he met Kurtz. He's the intruder the manager worried about, and the one who left the wood for them at the hut, which used to be his house. This Russian says the locals didn't mean any harm by attacking. They were afraid Kurtz would be taken from them. He tells Marlowe that Kurtz has enlarged his mind, and says Kurtz speaks eloquently about things like love. Marlowe learns that Kurtz has been raiding the nearby villages for ivory, with the help of this tribe, which treats him like a god. While Marlowe talks to the Russian, he looks up at the station through binoculars, and he realizes that the tops of the fence posts are actually human heads. Apparently Kurtz had lost any sense of restraint, and had taken to mounting the heads of men he considered rebels outside his station. Marlowe laughs when the Russian says these men were rebels, and he recalls the slaves at the company station that the company called criminals. He thinks the wilderness has overtaken Kurtz, and implies that Kurtz himself has become a savage. The manager and the other men come back to the steamer carrying Kurtz, who is extremely sick. While Kurtz goes through his mail, the manager motions to Marlowe to leave, so he can speak in private with Kurtz. Marlowe hears Kurtz shouting about how they're interrupting his plans, and he swears he'll return and carry out his ideas. The manager comes out and tells Marlowe that Kurtz has done the company more harm than good, because Kurtz's method was so unsound. The Russian approaches Marlowe and asks him not to talk about anything that will damage Kurtz's reputation when they go back. Marlowe tells the Russian he should leave, and warns him that the manager wanted to hang him, and the Russian runs away that night. Sometime after midnight, Marlowe awakes and finds Kurtz gone. When he climbs onto the riverbank, he can see the trail where Kurtz crawled on all fours through the grass, heading toward a fire in the distance, and he decides to circle around him and head him off. Kurtz tells Marlowe to leave and hide, and Marlowe realizes that if Kurtz just shouts loud enough for someone to hear, he could be killed. Kurtz tells him he had great plans, that he was on the threshold of great things, but Marlowe threatens to beat him if he doesn't return to the steamer. At noon the next day, they leave with Kurtz, and the people of the tribe gather on the riverbank and shout mournfully at Kurtz's departure. Kurtz grows weaker and weaker as they head back down the river toward the sea. One night, Marlowe enters his room, and Kurtz says he's waiting to die. While Marlowe watches him, a change comes over his face, as if he were seeing something. His last words are, "The horror, the horror." Shortly after, the boy comes into the mess room where the men are eating dinner, and announces that Kurtz is dead. Marlowe returns to Europe after that. He says he couldn't stand to be around ordinary people who didn't know the things he knew. One day, an official from the company comes to visit Marlowe. Before Kurtz died, he gave Marlowe all his papers and correspondence, and the official says the company has the rights to the documents. Marlowe only gives him the report for the International Society for the Suppression of Savage Customs, with the last part about exterminating all the brutes torn off, but the official isn't interested. 2 days later, a man saying he's Kurtz's cousin comes to Marlowe's door. He and Marlowe talk for a little, and Marlowe learns that Kurtz was a musician, in addition to being a painter and journalist. Lastly, a journalist shows up who says he was a colleague of Kurtz's. He says Kurtz was an incredible speaker, and should have been in politics, leading some extremist party. Marlowe gives him Kurtz's report. Kurtz had mentioned his fiancée to Marlowe, and Marlowe goes to see her, and to give her the rest of Kurtz's papers. She guesses that Marlowe must have admired Kurtz, as everyone did who knew him. Kurtz was an example of goodness who drew men toward him. Before Marlowe leaves, Kurtz's fiancée wants to know what his last words were. Marlowe lies, and says the last thing Kurtz said was her name. Marlowe's story is over, and with the tide out, they start to go up the Thames toward London. The narrator says the Thames seems to lead into the heart of an immense darkness, suggesting that this civilized place isn't far removed from the primitive jungle. One point critics debate is whether Heart of Darkness is racist. The black people in the book are hardly even people. They're a metaphor for savage, primitive man. But the book also points out how false this European idea of civilizing Africa was. The Europeans brutalized and enslaved the Africans. In the end, nobody really looks good, except for maybe Marlowe, who stands by commenting on what he sees. For more information about Heart of Darkness, check out the Heart of Darkness SparkNote on sparknotes.com. For a translation of the entire book into modern English, go to No Fear Literature at www.sparknotes.com/nofear/lit.